Hi, welcome to the All Center for Local History and Genealogy Research. We're part of the Morgantown Public Library, and we're located next door to the library on Spruce Street in what's referred to commonly as the historic Garlow House. Today I'd like to tell you a little bit about the most devastating fire in the history of Morgantown. It occurred in April of 1927 and is commonly known as the Strand Theater Fire, but in actuality it destroyed much more than just the Strand Theater. The entire block on the east side of High Street between Fayette and Wall Street was in ashes and rubble. Businesses across High Street were damaged, as was a building on the corner of Fayette and High. But before I tell you more about the fire, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the man whose house we're in right now. His name was Aaron Garlow. He built this house right behind all those buildings that burned in the fire. In fact, in the fire, he not only had his garage burned down, but he owned two of the three major buildings on High Street that were totally destroyed. So Aaron had a real connection with the fire in 1927. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that fire now. It's best to imagine yourself standing across the street looking at the block that burned. Today, that block includes such businesses as Gibby's Pub, as the Cold Stone Creamery, and the Elegant Alley Cat. So it's the block between Fayette Street and Wall Street on the east side of High. Back in 1927, if you mentally divide that block into four pretty equal pieces, on the left-hand end or corner of High Street and Fayette was a six-story building. It was known as the Main Street Building, but commonly referred to as the Strand Theater Building because it housed, among other things, the Strand Theater. In addition to the Strand Theater, there was the Strand Grill, there was the Brown Jewelry Store, and there was Phillips Music Store. Now, next to that six-story building was a three-story building known as the Orr Department Store. And this is the building in which the fire began. The Orr Department Store building also included Camuncey's Confectionery and a shoe store and some other smaller businesses. And right adjacent to it, going down the street further, was a four-story building known as the Morgantown Hardware Building. And that building also included other businesses. It included a millinery, a photography shop. On the right-hand corner of that block, it fortuitously occurred that a week before the fire, the building that was there, the Donnelly Building, was raised to make room for a new Woolworths 5 and 10. So at the time of the fire, that lot was vacant, and that probably saved the town from having the fire travel further down High Street. Back with me now to the wee morning hours of Thursday, April 14th, 1927. Two policemen are walking up Fayette Street coming back to the municipal building to report into police headquarters. And as they turned to enter the police entrance in the rear of the building, they noticed smoke coming from the back of the Orr department store building into the alley. They immediately notified the fire department, and it didn't take the fire department long to have their equipment on site since it was housed right there in the municipal building. The trouble was that the fire department couldn't determine exactly where the flames were because of all the smoke, and it took them a full 15 minutes before they determined that the flames were actually in the basement of the Orr department store. They also determined that the best way to get to the flames was to go down through the freight elevator in the sidewalk on High Street and enter the basement of the store that way. And so they four of them lowered themselves down to get into the basement. But when they broke open the door to the basement, of course, a rush of fresh air hit the flames, and the flames came shooting out, one witness said, halfway across High Street. For a few seconds, people were afraid that the four firemen had been burned to death, but some quick thinking sent rescuers down, and they were able to drag the four out. Two of them required artificial respiration, but all four of them eventually returned to continue fighting the fire. It was soon apparent that the fire was much more serious than had originally been thought. And so help was summoned from Westover and from as far away as Uniontown and Fairmont. And so one wonders how much the newly paved roads contributed to getting the fire departments from out of town here in a timely manner. They eventually did make it, and at the peak, 12 streams of water were focused on the fire. But in the meantime, while people were waiting for more firemen to arrive, and four of the firemen had been injured, volunteers were enlisted to help fight the fire. And you can imagine the chaos that existed. Remember, it was dark, it was noisy. Just imagine buildings with flames that are 6 stories, 3 stories, 4 stories high. And in a little bit, the floors started collapsing in some of the buildings. So you had the crashes associated with floors collapsing, and then when the floors collapsed, the walls collapsed. You had rubble tumbling down into the streets. You had the noise of the fire. You had the noise of the collapsing walls and floors. You had wires snapping, electric wires, telephone wires, trolley wires. You had windows across the street exploding from the heat. And then the ammunition that was stored in the Morgantown hardware began exploding. Ammunition for shotguns, for rifles, for pistols. It was a scene of chaos, and even though the power was out and there was no electrical or lighting, the flames from the fire allowed everyone close by to see. Embers were floating in the heated air all the way down to the end of High Street into the cemetery. And there were reports of the car tops in adjacent blocks being burned by embers landing on the soft tops of the 1927 vintage cars. And then to top everything off, the north wall on the 6-story building on the corner of Fayette Street collapsed. And when it did, it fell across Fayette Street onto the Titus building, which was a multi-story building where the subway shop is now. It destroyed the Morgantown, the High Street Market, and Yi Lung's Laundry, among other businesses in that building. And even though the building didn't catch on fire, much of it was totally destroyed. In the end, some 20 businesses were destroyed by the fire, and just as many private residential apartments in the upper floors of those buildings. And several more businesses were damaged by the fire, broken windows and such. The insurance estimators were estimating that the total losses were between $1.5 and $2 million, which was substantial for that time. and only a third of it was insured. Each business had a safe, but the performance of the safes varied. For instance, the jewelers in the Main Street building had a safe, a large safe, that they kept their precious stones in and their watch inventory. And that safe made it through the fire in good shape. The owner reported that many of the watches were slightly damaged, but that all were repairable. On the other hand, the safe in the Orr department store was found to have been damaged, perhaps by a falling floor or wall, or perhaps the integrity was faulty to begin with. But when it was opened, the contents were just a solid mass of agglomerated ash. All the ledgers and important papers were gone. A substantial amount of cash was burned, and that was a big loss. The music store in that building lost 50 pianos in that fire. But the owner could take some consolation in knowing that 3 days later, on the following Monday, he had 2 insurance policies that were going to expire. So the damages were great. They varied from business to business, but in the end, there were 2 great things to be thankful for. First of all, that morning, that early morning of Thursday, April 14th, 1927, the air was still. Had there been any kind of breeze, there's little doubt that the fire would have spread down High Street into the next block, would have been able to cross Wall Street with the narrowness of that street. Had there been any wind that morning, it's possible that other parts of the city could have caught on fire. In fact, the fire chief was amazed that with all the burning embers that there weren't fires that happened in other parts already. The second thing to be thankful for was that there were no deaths, there were no serious injuries even. Thanks for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you learned a little bit about Morgantown's history. Stop in and see us sometime. We're open 6 days a week. Thanks.